The laughter started light, the way nervous people laugh when something doesn't fit the picture they rehearsed in their heads. It was a shimmering gala, cameras catching the sparkle of borrowed crystal and rented confidence, and into all that gloss she walked in a faded cotton dress, hand-mended at the seams, hems uneven like a coastline. Phones tilted. Eyes flicked. A few smiles sharpened. We treated the moment like a harmless joke and let the joke become a mood. Hours later, under hot lights and thinning patience, she lifted the edge of that old dress and turned us toward a history we had never been brave enough to face. The room fell quiet. Even the chandelier seemed to listen. We had spent months polishing this night. The committee had divided duties like slices of a perfect cake: sponsorship letters, seating charts, graphics so glossy you could see yourself inside them. We rehearsed small talk in our cars and repeated agendas like hymns. The tone was set to triumph. Our city, we told ourselves, had learned, improved, risen. The annual fundraiser would simply confirm that progress with a bar that glowed and a playlist that never stumbled. The venue was a renovated train depot, the kind of place that once separated tickets by windows and bodies by signs but had since been reborn into a space for tasteful photographs. The brick carried its old smoke in quiet layers. Industrial beams framed the ceiling like ribs. Someone had hired a scent vendor so invisible clouds of citrus floated above the crowd to make the air feel expensive. We wanted a portrait of renewal. The depot was our tidy metaphor. She arrived after sundown. We noticed because arrivals were currency that night. The dress appeared first, the way certain colors announce themselves. It was the green of dandelion stems, muted by years, with stitching in a slightly darker thread that curved around the waist and across the shoulders. The sleeves ended in careful cuffs, each button a tiny survivor that didn't match its neighbor. When she moved, the fabric whispered, not silk but something humbler, honest, unafraid of daylight. She wore no diamonds, only a thin bracelet that looked like it had been polished by touch rather than by machine. We knew of her more than we knew her. She had grown up on the south side, the part of town that used to be hemmed in by zoning we pretended to forget. She worked now as a community archivist and volunteer mentor, the kind of person who refused to be bored by teenagers. She had RSVP'd without flourish and claimed a seat at a table we had named for a major donor. That detail did not go unnoticed. The laughter did not burst, it bloomed in pockets. First, a whisper with a smile still attached. Then a phone raised to capture a candid. A caption drafted and deleted, drafted again. Someone murmured that the dress looked like a curtain from a modest kitchen. Someone else said it resembled a sewing project for beginners. We eased our discomfort with humor that hugged the edges of cruelty. We told ourselves she would not hear because the music was loud and the crowd generous. We told ourselves we meant nothing by it, as if meaning were a switch we could flip off. But meaning finds its own electricity. An usher guided her past the photo wall. She declined, or perhaps she simply kept walking. At the bar, the bartender offered her the list of signature drinks that sold safety in bright colors. She chose water. Near the silent auction, a stylist from a boutique fawned over sequins and feathers draped on mannequins. When she drifted close, the stylist's compliments fell to the floor like scattered beads. The room acted as if fabrics had pedigrees and some lineages did not deserve witnesses. Throughout the evening, we stole glances that pretended to be curiosity and might have been a kind of measurement. We measured her against the night we wanted. We measured her against our pre-approved story of a city healed. And every time, our laughter, quiet, practiced, plausible, helped the math break in our favor. The program began with brisk claps and prepared fervor. The MC kept the tempo light, bouncing between auction items and donor appreciations like stones skimming a lake. Plates clattered softly as servers made their choreography look effortless. The depot's old timetables, preserved as decor, loomed above our heads, suggesting punctuality and order. We basked in our own competence. She moved like someone in a museum, considering, not consuming. When the video montage rolled, stock footage of children with backpacks, drone shots of new playgrounds, ribbon cuttings that smoothed complex stories into tidy loops, she watched with a stillness that felt deliberate. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers barely interlaced. Up close, the fabric of the dress revealed paler rectangles, like ghosts of removed patches. There were initials stitched inside the sleeve, tiny and exact, thread the color of river mud. A donor at our table leaned toward us and asked if we knew her. We offered biographical fragments because fragments let us feel informed while remaining unaccountable. Someone added a rumor that she sometimes walked the neighborhoods with a small recorder and asked elders to talk about the mills, the marches, the curfews that arrived like weather. Someone else mentioned a podcast episode where she spoke about the danger of paperless memories. We nodded, pleased to be orbiting knowledge without colliding with it. Then the auction took a sharper turn, a private dinner with a celebrity chef, a weekend at a mountain house, a vintage watch donated by an estate. Bids jumped like sparks. The MC teased the room toward higher numbers, calling generosity a sport. We competed to be seen as compassionate. Amid the commotion, a security guard drifted near her. His path looked casual from far away. Up close, it traced an old pattern. He lingered just long enough to remind anyone watching who receives the benefit of the doubt, and who receives the benefit of surveillance. She felt the hovering and stepped aside with a grace that made avoidance look like choice. The dress moved as if it carried its own gravity. The green caught the light and released it like a leaf after rain. A server paused to admire it, and then remembered the route back to the kitchen. A board member smiled past her as if smiling were an act of absolution. When the keynote speaker spoke about progress, he used numbers that glowed. Increased graduation rates. Decreased incidents. More access to something that sounded like opportunity and looked like a spreadsheet. We applauded the arithmetic of it all. We forgot that numbers behave when you place them in columns. People behave when history lets them breathe. The keynote thanked the sponsors, thanked the city's leadership, thanked the committee for its tasteful choices, thanked the rail depot for rebirth. He did not thank the unnamed hands that once loaded trains in separate lines. Near the end of his remarks, he gestured toward the audience for examples of transformation. The MC, prepared for possibility, scanned the room for a story that matched the brand. That was when someone whispered her name, and the whisper traveled like a rumor that wanted to become a truth. The MC invited her to the stage to share a reflection. It was meant to be brief, a warm note to bridge dessert and donating. She rose. The bracelet at her wrist caught a filament of light, as if a past sun had been trapped there and was now escaping. She climbed the steps as if the stage were not a platform but a threshold. We felt it then, a mild alarm in our chests. Some of us worried about awkwardness, about tone, about the way the room's temperature might change. Some of us worried that the old dress would upstage the new narrative. Some of us worried that she would be grateful in the wrong way, or honest in the right way. She stood at the podium and rested her hands on either side as if steadying the story before it moved. The MC stepped back. The key lights painted her face in soft planes. The rest of the room, set suddenly at the edge of dusk, leaned toward clarity. She began by describing origin. Not the kind with documents and seals, but the kind stitched into fabric and carried in secret. The dress, she explained, had lived several lives. It began as a flour sack in a household that stretched everything it owned. A grandmother rinsed the printed letters from the cloth until only distant shadows remained. The sack became a baby's blanket, then a curtain, then finally, when wages refused to rise and prices refused to fall, it became a dress for a girl who was told that Sundays required beauty even when the week did not grant permission. She spoke of the mill that sold the flour, a mill that hummed like a promise but posted its pay differentials like a threat. The dress passed through that mill as a message wrapped in necessity. Its seams were taught by a mother who learned to sew from an aunt who learned in a back room behind a store that addressed her as a problem. Those stitches, tiny and relentless, made their way through holidays and heatwaves, through years when the city mapped services around certain blocks as if drawing a circle could make people disappear. The dress survived a march. It brushed the knees of women who walked under the gaze of men with batons that believed in their own certainty. It held the scent of church basements where coffee was both strategy and comfort. It collected the dust of courthouse steps where promises were issued like ration cards. When it tore, It was mended with patches cut from an apron that had seen too many kitchens and not enough tables set with fairness. The paler rectangles on the fabric were not defects, they were annotations. She named names of streets that had been renamed to be easier to sell to newcomers. She named the lone office that smiled but denied. She named the train depot whose platforms had once been divided by more than destination. She did not accuse the room, she unfolded it. She did not ask for pity, she offered evidence. The dress, she said, was her family's ledger. It recorded what official records ignored. It was worn to funerals when young men were taken by policy disguised as fate. It was worn to celebrations where victory tasted like relief. It came to this gala because it refused to be archived into silence. Tonight, in a room rehearsed to celebrate progress, the dress wanted witnesses rather than admirers. She lifted the hem to show the row of initials stitched near the edge. Each letter, small and stubborn, marked a woman who had worn it when the city thought less of her than she thought of herself. The initials crowded the margin like a chorus. Her own letters had been added last week in a quiet kitchen with the window cracked open to let the air judge the truth of it. Phones lowered. Hands fell to laps. Security drifted toward the perimeter as if repelled by gravity they could not claim to understand. The MC folded the program into a smaller square and held it like an apology. Our laughter, which had earlier moved like a breeze across a field of tall grass, vanished so completely that we wondered if we had invented it. She ended with the depot. Once, trains carried bodies away from chances they were never meant to find. Once, tickets were sold in separate lines that pretended to be temporary solutions. The building's bones remembered even if the chandelier did not. Wearing the dress here was not an act of defiance, she explained, it was an act of restoration. The space wanted the truth of its echoes to be heard. Resolution and impact 7-10-minute pacing. The applause began reluctantly, as if our hands were uncertain whether they had the right to make sound. Then it gathered itself, not into a standing ovation, that would have been too easy, too performative, but into something steadier, an acknowledgement that left no cover for denial. The MC returned and thanked her with a voice freshly scrubbed of patter. Dessert arrived late and went mostly untouched. In the minutes that followed, the room reorganized itself. Conversations shifted registers. People approached her not with the greedy curiosity of gossip but with the gentler caution of students entering a library. She stood beside the stage and received their words with the same stillness that had defined her arrival. The bracelet at her wrist ceased to sparkle and simply rested, a circle resolving itself. At our table, a donor who had earlier made a joke about curtains stared into a glass of water and traced the rim with one finger, as if learning a boundary. The security guard adjusted his earpiece and walked a path that finally led him nowhere in particular. The stylist from the boutique knelt near the hem of the dress and studied the stitching with the respect she reserved for handwork that humbled trends. A server paused to steady the stack of plates and forgot to move because the sight of the initials had insisted on a moment of quiet. A committee member pulled out her phone to draft a message for the nonprofit's social channels, then set it down again. The instinct to frame the revelation into shareable shapes felt instant and wrong. The night needed to breathe. The story needed room to live without captions that cut meaning to fit a grid. At the exit, the old depot's doors opened to the train tracks, now decorative lines guiding tourists' feet. The air smelled of creosote that had worked itself into the wood decades ago and refused to leave. The city spread out in lit pockets, some stubbornly dim, some newly bright. We watched her step into the coolness like someone returning to a conversation rather than leaving a party. In the days that followed, the dress lingered in our thoughts the way certain songs do, turning up at unexpected moments. It appeared in the reflective glare of office windows, in the hush of morning kitchens, in the checkout aisle where a clerk asked if we wanted to round up for charity, and suddenly the request felt like a question about who gets rounded down. We kept recalling those paler rectangles on the fabric and realized our city had its own pale rectangles. Lots where houses used to be, blocks where clinics closed, a school with a library that had been boxed up and stored in a room that used to smell like stories. Some of us wrote checks. Some of us wrote messages to council members. A few of us went to the archives and asked, with more humility than usual, to see photographs that had not yet been digitized because no one had declared them important enough. A teacher printed out a map of the old red lines and taped it above her desk to remember where progress should report for duty. A bakery hung a sign that offered day-old bread free to anyone who asked without requiring the ceremony of need. The committee met again to debrief. The word debrief sounded comically inadequate, like calling a thunderstorm a weather event. We looked at the metrics and found them shy. The event had raised money, but the night had raised a different ledger we did not yet know how to keep. Someone suggested an exhibit on textiles and testimony. Someone else spoke of an oral history project with stipends that respected time rather than scavenged it. The train depot's event manager mentioned a policy change. No more scent vendors masking the air. Let the building keep its own truth. No one mentioned the laughter directly. But it was there, a ghost that disliked sunlight. We carried it to our cars and let it sit in the passenger seat all the way home. The next morning, some of us found the courage to name it. We said the word out loud in rooms that did not clap. We recognized how easily cruelty wears a cologne of sophistication. We recognized how often we claim innocence as if intention could cleanse impact. For her part, she returned to the work she had been doing before the gala, which is to say she returned to work most of us find convenient to praise but reluctant to join. She visited elders and recorded their stories. She taught teenagers to listen beyond their playlists. She wrote a grand proposal that asked for needles, thread, and a room with good light. She wore the dress again to a Sunday service in a small church that measures holiness by how well people share potluck pies. The initials at the hem caught the glances of women who carry their own ledgers beneath their jackets. Weeks later, the nonprofit hosted a smaller gathering at the depot. No photo wall, no signature drinks, no auction items requiring second homes. Folding chairs replaced ballroom round tables. A circle of textiles lay on a long wooden table like a quiet procession, aprons bleached by work, handkerchiefs embroidered with initials and intentions, a protest banner that had been washed but not quite freed of the grit from the day it did its job. People came, sat, and touched. They told stories into the air as if the rafters could file them. We understood then that the dress had not been a mistake in a room of correct choices. It had been a key. It unlocked a cabinet we kept closed because we preferred our history as decor rather than instruction. It taught us that progress without memory is a costume that does not fit in the rain. If you are reading this and feeling the defensive itch that insists you would never have laughed, ask your memory to replay the moment when the unfamiliar enters a room tailored to your comfort. Remember the reflex that keeps you safe by making someone else small. Consider the garments in your own life that have been asked to become invisible so events can feel seamless. Consider what would happen if you wore them into the brightest room you know. What does it mean to celebrate renewal in buildings that still echo with division? What does it cost to suture a city's narrative with threads strong enough to hold grief and glory at once? And when the next person walks in wearing a story instead of a trend, will we measure them against our picture, or will we finally expand the frame? The dress asked for witnesses. The night offered them. The ledger remains open, initials added in small letters by hands that are learning to be steady. The question now is not whether we learned something at a gala, but whether we have the nerve to live as if we did.